So tēnā koutou katoa, on behalf of the New Zealand Centre for Public Law here at the Victoria University of Wellington and the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies, I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's session on global governance and the emergence of global institutions for the 21st century. I'm Ruby Moynihan-Marksick, a Senior Fellow at the New Zealand Centre for Public Law, visiting from the University College Cork in Ireland. And I've got the pleasure today of welcoming and introducing our distinguished guest speakers, Mr. Augusto Lopez Claros, and our respondent, Mr. Colin Keating. Augusto is the Executive Director of the Global Governance Forum. He is an international economist with over 30 years of experience in international organizations. He has worked as the Director of the Global Indicators Group at the World Bank. Previously, he was Chief Economist and Director of the Global Competitiveness Program at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. He has also worked for the International Monetary Fund in Russia during the 1990s. More recently, he has spent time as a Senior Fellow at Georgetown University. Augusto will speak today about how the current UN-based world system of governance, largely formulated in the mid-20th century after the Second World War, is not able to deal with the urgent, multiple and interlinked challenges facing the world today. He will share his rich experience and discuss proposals from his recent co-authored book, which seeks to significantly reform our current system of global governance so it is more able to deal with the interconnected environmental, social, economic and security risks. According to the latest World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, powerful economic, demographic and technological forces are shaping a new balance of power. The result is an unsettled geopolitical landscape, one in which states are increasingly viewing opportunities and challenges through unilateral lenses. What were once givens regarding alliance structures and multilateral systems no longer hold, as states question the value of these long-standing frameworks, adopting more nationalist agendas. If stakeholders fail to reimagine or adapt mechanisms for coordination during this unsettled period, opportunities for action on key priorities will begin to slip away. And against this background, we greatly look forward to hearing Augusto's proposals for reforming our collective response to global risks. Augusto had planned to be here with us in person, but unfortunately, with the global current pandemic, we replaced the scheduled visit with today's online seminar, and we're sure the discussions will be equally rich and engaging. Augusto will speak for around 15 minutes today, and after that, we will hear a response from someone who has an enormous depth of experience with our multilateral institutions, Mr. Colin Keating. He's a former permanent representative of New Zealand to the United Nations, serving from 1993 to 1996, and on the Security Council from 1993 to 1994, present for both the Rwandan genocide and the mission to Somalia. He's a Senior Research Fellow at Columbia University and was the Executive Director of the Security Council report. Colin will speak for around 10 minutes today, and then I will give Augusto a chance to respond to Colin's comments. After that, I'll hand over to Renee Morjani from the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies, who will chair the Q&A. So we warmly welcome those of you who have questions at any point during the discussion to please use the Zoom Q&A function, which is on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen, to type in your questions. And Renee will then gather these and address them on your behalf to Augusto or Colin. So please do also indicate who your question is for. After this, Jaden Van Lewin will, also from the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies, will wrap up and we will finish by 1 p.m. So without further delay, Augusto, I pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruby, for that very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It is not what I expected, to be absolutely frank. I would have preferred much, to have been with you in the flesh last April. But I am certainly happy that in the context of what's happening with the coronavirus, we are at least able to connect in this way. And I very much hope that I can actually visit you in the period ahead, perhaps in the next year or so, to have a fuller engagement and discussion. You know, let me give you a little bit of background to the book. As you well know, the United Nations was born out of the chaos and the destruction of World War II. The declaration that was issued by President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill in early 1942, and that was subsequently endorsed by some 20 nations then involved in the war effort, is in fact the seed that gave rise to the United Nations and that culminated in the adoption of the United Nations Charter in San Francisco in June of 1945 by its 51 founding members. My guess is that the killing on a scale never seen before during World War II, we're talking about 60 million fatalities, may have focused the attention of the leaders in a very powerful way and convinced them that provisions should be made to ensure that such wars would not ever happen again. So the main legacy of that conflict was the United Nations and the agencies that support its work. And in the decades that followed, the United Nations expanded its membership as decolonization and the application of the principle of self-determination of peoples unfolded with great speed, especially in the 1950s and then the 1960s. Each new member signed on to the principles embodied in the Charter, which today remains largely unchanged from when it was first adopted 75 years ago. By the end of the 20th century, the United Nations had 189 members, and today it has 193 members, accounting for something like 99% of the world's population. Of course, we know that it is flawed in many ways. We have the veto in the Security Council. We have the one country, one vote principle in the General Assembly. But at least I am of the opinion that there is little doubt that the adoption of the Charter was a very important moment in history that led to important innovations in the area of international cooperation in the following decades. Two that come to mind as important achievements of the United Nations during its 75 years was the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and the contributions that the International Court of Justice has made to the promotion of the importance of the concept of the international rule of law. Now, let me come to the present, having given you a bit of a historical background. The last 75 years have witnessed profound changes in the levels of complexity underpinning our economic, social, political, environmental systems. Some of it is linked to the rapid expansion of connectivity, non-linearity, and exponential growth brought about by rapid technological change. Now, the problem that we face is that the institutions that we have today are struggling to cope with the challenges of an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world, because these institutions have largely failed to adapt to the changes and to the needs of a rapidly evolving age. To a great extent, they have really remained frozen in time. The UN Charter 75 years ago did not make any mention of climate change and nuclear proliferation. It did speak of peace and security and poverty, but the first of these two problems, climate change and nuclear proliferation, were simply not in the radar screen at that moment. And yet, they are existential threats in the world today. The consequence of this freezing in time, if you wish, is that major planetary issues are being neglected, and we're risking being overwhelmed by a broad range of problems, the solutions of which require effective problem-solving mechanisms and institutions, which simply we don't have. And of course, the kinds of challenges that I'm talking about. I'm talking about climate change, I'm talking about nuclear proliferation. And when I talk about climate change, I lump with it the biodiversity loss, rising sea levels, all the collateral effects associated with this process. We have a problem of rapidly widening income disparities, and we, of course, have an outstanding problem of extreme poverty, or poverty more generally, which has been, of course, made worse by COVID and the current, very deep economic crisis that we're facing. We have a financial system that remains vulnerable to shocks, as was made clear 10 years ago, 11 years ago with the global financial crisis. We have very constrained fiscal spaces because in 2008, 2009, we responded to that crisis by massive spending to essentially spend our way out of that crisis. And we are confronting exactly the same situation today as governments everywhere try to reduce even further the limited fiscal space that we had in the last few years. In the book that was mentioned by Ruby in her kind introduction, a copy of which you may have seen, and I can show it to you. This is Cambridge University Press, 2020. My co-authors, Arthur Dahl and Naya Groff, and I argue that the time is ripe today to think creatively and proactively about modernizing our current UN-based global order. We need to strengthen our political and institutional structures so that our societies will be better able to cope with the kind of destabilizing shocks that now have become the new normal. Our current order has few credible defenders. We have really, in the course of the research that we have done for this book, we have talked to many, many people all over the world. We have not seen plausible arguments to the effect that we can just muddle through for the next 50 years and that somehow the current system will deliver solutions to the problems that we face. Because we will continue to live in this unstable equilibrium over the last 75 years. Nobody has made that case, certainly not with any degree of credibility. Indeed, we live in a world in which no one is in charge, and in which, because of this, we're constantly surprised by global catastrophes. From the near implosion of our global financial system 11 years ago, to COVID-19 in 2020, which has exposed just how vulnerable and fragile our economic and other systems are, on our way to something else in the medium term, perhaps linked to an acceleration of climate change. And these crises are interconnected. In early 2020, we were still living with the after effects of 2008, including wartime levels of public debt in many advanced economies. So, what does this mean for the future of global governance? And what I like to do in the time that I have left is to illustrate with a few concrete suggestions which we believe would contribute to reforming our UN architecture, to enhance its effectiveness, and to empower it to find sensible solutions to the global challenges that we face. And what I like to do is I like to focus on two reforms that I think can be done easily in the short term, and two reforms that are a little bit more ambitious and that are perhaps more for the longer term. So let me begin with the first one. In 1947, Albert Einstein, who participated in a very active way in the debates that took place in the context of the formation of the United Nations, he said that, I quote, "The method of representation at the United Nations should be considerably modified." He said the moral authority of the UN would be considerably enhanced if the delegates were elected directly by the people. And the point that he was making is essentially that it was necessary to strengthen the democratic legitimacy of the United Nations, to establish a firmer linkage between the organization and the peoples that it was meant to serve. Now, one can easily endorse this principle enunciated by Einstein. And in fact, in the book, we fully endorse this view, and we suggest that we should move the General Assembly to make it a body that is more representative, more democratic, with a weighted system of voting. I don't have the time to go into a detailed specification of the proposal that we put forward as to how to move to a system of weighted voting. We also say that we should give the General Assembly some limited jurisdiction in a few areas and allow it to do some legislation. But in order to be able to do this, you actually require to amend the charter. And this is a big obstacle for now. And so in our book, as a transitional phase, we propose the creation of a World Parliamentary Assembly, complementary to the General Assembly, which can be established under Article 22 of the UN Charter, which gives the General Assembly authority to establish subsidiary organs necessary for the performance of its functions. And we think that doing this, which can be done literally in the short term, and there are a number of bodies that have already expressed a strong support for this idea, from the European Parliament to other such bodies. We think that the elected representatives would represent individuals and societies rather than states, and therefore they would not necessarily vote along national lines. I think one of the problems that we have in the UN and in the General Assembly in particular is that countries are there basically representing the interests of their states. We think that if you had something like a World Parliamentary Assembly, you could expect the formation of coalitions, which would be issue-based. Groups of people straddling national borders that would join forces to work on the environment, on human rights, on gender equality, on areas of common interest. And in this way, they would be better able to promote international cooperation. They would see the problems through the lens of humanity's better interest rather than wearing their national hats. And we agree with Richard Falk when he says that this initiative would help us move away, and I quote, from our war system in which international decisions are still made by heavily armed nations that are poised to destroy each other. So this is one of the sort of major reforms that we're proposing in our book. Let me move on to the second one, which has to do with the way that the United Nations funds itself. The United Nations has a regular budget, which funds the UN Secretariat. It has a peacekeeping budget, and it has a budget that finances the activities of the specialized agencies. And these budgets are financed by assessed contributions from members. In addition, there is a separate budget that is funded by voluntary earmark contributions from some of the wealthier members in support of particular agencies and programs. And it turns out that by now, this voluntary or earmark contribution budget is much, much larger than the regular budget. Because especially the wealthier countries have essentially taken over the United Nations and used it as a mechanism, to channel funds to their particular projects. Contributions to the UN budget are heavily asymmetric. The top 10 contributors account for about 70% of the budget. We think that the time has come to essentially do two things. First of all, to clean up the way that the UN funds itself, to have a system in place that is much more transparent in the way that it collects resources. And then the second, a more difficult issue, but it is something that can be done if you do the first, is essentially to generate more resources for the UN, which at the moment is very limited in its ability to do things because it simply doesn't have the resources. We put forward a proposal where the United Nations would simply assess member contributions as a fixed percentage of their respective gross national income. It's a very transparent system. Let me give you an example. If a total world gross national income today is about $86 trillion, if you simply said every member country will contribute 0.1% of GNI, you generate $86 billion, which is considerably more than the UN collects today, even if you add all the voluntary earmark contributions. The main advantage of the system is simplicity, transparency. Every country gets assessed at the same rate. The criteria for burden sharing is crystal clear. Let me move on and say a few things in the 5 minutes that I have left about the longer term reforms that are also embedded in the proposals that we make. We think that over the longer term, we should give consideration to the more ambitious vision of the United Nations, which was contemplated at the outset in 1942, 1943, when Churchill, Roosevelt, and other leading thinkers were trying to sort of develop the concept of the United Nations. When you read that literature, which we have done, it is really quite fascinating to see that initially the model for the United Nations was actually to be inspired by the Constitution of the United States of America, by the founding fathers and the fact that they created essentially a federal government in which the federal government has the monopoly over the use of force, for instance, and the management of the economy and so on. In the book, we have a very detailed proposal for how to calculate voting shares linked to a country's GDP, to a country's population, relative population size, and also something that we call a membership share. I won't go into the details. It's in chapter 4. There is an appendix into the book that shows what would be the weights that countries would have according to this criteria. And if we were able to do this, which does require amendment to the charter, and therefore it's not something that is likely to happen in the near term, then we think that at that time, with a General Assembly that would be more representative of the global community, then you could actually give it some legislative functions, perhaps initially in a limited way, focused on issues of peace and security and management of the environment, which at the moment we don't have. Let's not pretend. The Paris Agreement of 2015 is a complete failure. Emissions have gone up every single year since 2015. The commitments that were made for reducing emissions were completely voluntary, and therefore we have left management of the global environment to chance and to the well-meaning actions of a few countries, mainly in Europe, New Zealand, perhaps, and a few others. All right, so it's not working, and the fact that it's not working is a serious threat to our future. One of the main flaws of our current UN system is the absence of a reliable international enforcement mechanism to carry out certain decisions of the Security Council. Article 43 of the Charter says the following: says all members of the United Nations, in order to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security, undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Article 43 was the main reason we created the United Nations. It was essentially to lay out the principle of collective security. It was to create a body that would actually create a framework for peace and security and would prevent the next war from happening. It is an article that is a dead letter. It has never been implemented. Therefore, there is already a legal basis to be something that was already called upon in Article 43. Building on the legal framework already established, one could nurture the development of a true system of collective security as a way not only of enabling the United Nations to fulfill its mandate in the area of peace and security, but also to generate a peace dividend that might release global resources for social and economic development. As you well know, and I think this is one of the lessons that is going to come out of COVID-19, is that there is massive waste of resources in the world in such things as, propping up and building up our military establishment at a time when in many of these countries, you have extremely vulnerable, very ineffective public health systems, and the vulnerability of their lack of investment in the public sector has been shown dramatically, during the last few months. So one of the challenges that we face for the future is how to make better use of scarce resources, how to allocate resources for social protection, for safety net, for the welfare of the population. And one element of doing that in a better way is essentially to rethink our entire security structure, which induces countries to overspend on defense because nobody provides collective security on a global way. Let me conclude by saying that I hope you will agree that the collapse of the present system would have devastating consequences on a global scale. I think I share the views expressed by some of your more enlightened thinkers in New Zealand. I'm thinking of Helen Clark. I'm thinking of Amanda Ellis, your former ambassador to Geneva, who basically are making the case that COVID-19 is nothing but a preamble. It is a foretaste. It is a warning of what is likely coming in the years to come, essentially as a result of climate change. But not only. I'm an economist, and if you ask me, can I guarantee you that we're not going to have a global financial crisis in the next 10 years? I certainly will not do that. So we are facing a whole range of risks. And to me and to my co-authors, it is evident that we need to act now to strengthen the international order so as to avoid having to rebuild a global institutional framework in the future under a much more adverse set of circumstances. It seems that we owe that much to our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augusto. These thought-provoking and much-needed proposals, and I'd like to hand straight over to Colin Keating for your response.
Thank you very much, Ruby, and a special thanks and a warm welcome to Augusto for his contribution here today, but also I want to congratulate you and your co-authors on your book, which I think is a really momentous and important work. And I say so with the benefit of probably being one of the few people who have read it twice. It's 400 and more pages, and so it's a labor that is really worth undertaking to not only dip into, but look at this book in detail. It's a treasure trove of research and information, which I think is a first point, and it deserves to be congratulated simply because of that. But it is more than a research which analyzes what the current system is. There are plenty of other very good books about that. And it's much more than simply a diagnosis of the current problems. It actually also gives us a vision of what might be in the future. And I was delighted that today in his presentation, Augusto focused significantly on how one might make the transition from here to there, because it's not as if one can leap to the brave new world in one step. And I think that's a very intelligent and politically astute conclusion. As Augusto said when he was wrapping up his remarks, you know, there are really two possibilities. One is we simply drift along and hope that things will survive. But the most predictable and likely outcome of that is another disaster, and reform to be built on the basis of a huge tragedy. Now, some of the kind of potential disasters that we face in the 21st century would make the 60 million lives who were lost in World War II look small. And I'm thinking of all kinds of possibilities relating to the accidental or deliberate or terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction. So in terms of applying the precautionary principle, given the huge amount of risk and the implications of the risk, it does lead very much to the conclusion that we should act now, and that involves prevention rather than cure, rather than waiting to fix the system, the 1945 model, which again, as I agree entirely with Augusto, it is failed to adapt to the changing needs of the international community. He's absolutely right that amending the Charter is an incredibly difficult proposition, particularly when the kinds of amendments that will be necessary to make any significant progress would trench quite harshly on the interests of some of the powers that were given excessive power in the 1945 model. And I'm thinking in particular, but not only of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. I think it's worth always remembering what the Americans say. Turkeys never vote for an early Christmas. And in effect, trying to make changes in the Charter is asking the turkeys to vote for Christmas, because it would involve depowering those who currently have anachronistic levels of power in the institution. Now, I think that it is really important to focus on issues like weighted voting. It's really important to focus on issues like the funding model. And it's really important to focus on the democratic deficits. There are really genuine democratic deficits, and it's not only the legitimacy of the elected voices of the public, the parliamentarians, who could add value to our institutions, but also the role of civil society and the role of the private sector. And I mention the latter in particular because it's particularly acute for those of us here in New Zealand. I mean, a year ago, in the aftermath of the terrible terrorist incident in Christchurch, when it became clear that the media platforms were actually empowering and encouraging this curse of right-wing terrorism and violence. When New Zealand sought to make a response to that problem, it became very clear that there was absolutely no point at all in going to the United Nations and trying to ask the General Assembly or the Security Council to pass a resolution. The reality was that one had to engage directly with the sources of the vehicles of the problem, which were the media giants themselves. And so the Prime Minister became very involved in what became known as the Christchurch Call, which was in effect a political outreach to the media organisations themselves. And the fact that our collective governance institutions had no capacity to help in dealing with this particular problem is itself another example of the kind of indictment we face. I would quickly like to touch on the idea of a World Parliamentary Assembly. I agree that there is a transitional step that we can and should think about in this respect. I think what Augusto was proposing was something which would have quite strong elements in common with the current European Parliament. But I like to add a note of caution. I mean, I think it's going to be, that might be a step too far as a first step, because I think what we're seeing already in Europe is a significant pushback against the centralization of power. And it is actually reinforcing the anarchic tendencies that are already in place, which threaten to further undermine not only our national but also our global governance institutions. I think we probably need to contemplate a separate role that will ensure that we do begin the process of engaging parliamentarians. The problem is that at the present time, while most countries have a parliament, in a lot of countries, those parliaments aren't separate from the executive. I mean, just imagine if we had representatives from the Chinese equivalent of the legislature. Does anyone seriously believe that they will behave separately from the policy expectations of the executive, which is controlled by the Communist Party behind the executive? And variations of that are true in many other more or less autocratic states around the world. I think that proposition would, if it was the fact that individual parliamentarians from genuinely democratic countries were present, but they were actually dealing with purported parliamentarians who were actually agents of the executive branch of their state, instead of being a win-win for resolving the democratic deficit, that would be a win-lose for the resolving the democratic deficit. I would like also to say a few words about the Security Council. I think there was a brilliant point that is in the book that it's described the current Security Council as an outdated paradigm. And I think this is absolutely true. The organization has passed its use by date. And it's simply not capable of reform in the way people currently talk about it. And indeed, most of the reforms that some argue for improving its legitimacy by adding a few more permanent members will, in my opinion, make it significantly worse. I mean, you don't solve a democratic deficit in society which is controlled by a few aristocrats by simply increasing the number of aristocrats. And that is not going to make life better for the ordinary. Oops, I've got a phone which, sorry. So I honestly think that the Security Council is a problem. We do need a new executive council. We do need, and this is an important proposal in the book, but I do think it needs to be one which is created by bypassing the Security Council rather than reforming it. And my last point is this: I come to whether or not it is wise and appropriate to add additional responsibilities to the General Assembly. First, I would say it is absolutely the right thing to do to reform, re-energize and improve the General Assembly. There's a quote in the book describing the current institution as being mind-numbingly boring, and that's true. But I do think that that reforming the General Assembly has to be done, and the politics of this will have to be accomplished. And indeed, the politics of achieving any change in parliamentary involvement with the UN, any change in the system of funding, will actually have to address the politics of change. And one of the politics of change is the need to take out of play the current Security Council and replace it with some other powerful institution. Because as Augusto rightly said, it's that Chapter 7 part of the current charter which authorizes decision-making which has binding legal effect. And I think that therefore the building on that with a new institution, which is capable of drawing the legitimacy out of Chapter 7 of the Charter, that can then take important decisions, not only on the climate area, but when you think about what would you do to improve the global response to something like COVID-19. It does require the concept of an institution in which it meets at sufficiently high level and it meets with sufficient legitimacy to be able to take decisions which reach beyond the peace and security mandate of the Security Council or the mandate of the General Assembly, and engage the decision makers, the key decision makers in the world on how to bring to bear the economic, social and political, as well as health dimensions of a problem, so that we get a coordinated global response, which has been so tragically missing in the COVID experience. So at that point, I want to say again, thank you, Augusto, for your contribution, and I want to express the hope that we do see you in person here to continue this conversation in more depth in the next year or so.
Thank you very much, Colin, for your comments. Augusto, I'd like to give you the chance to respond, if you'd like to.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you, Colin, for your excellent and very encouraging remarks. I'm glad that the session is being recorded, because one could simply do a transcript of your remarks and you could turn that into a review of our book, which I would strongly encourage you to do, please, and publish it somewhere. Let me briefly respond to some of your observations. All of them are really excellent, and in the interest of time, let me be brief. On the World Parliamentary Assembly, I was not able to get into some of the details presented in the book, but we see the World Parliamentary Assembly as we sort of conceptualize it, initially in an advisory role to the General Assembly. We provide actually a specific proposal for the distribution of the membership. And Colin, you obviously pick up a very important point, which is, how does one enhance the democratic legitimacy in the context, of course, of important members of the UN who themselves are not democracies? But, that was a problem we had at the outset of the United Nations as well. It's no different today. In fact, if anything, it's probably a little bit better today, because the world has moved by fits and starts into being more democratic than it was 50 years ago. I think it's an issue that we deal with in the book in some detail. And one possible way to address it, Colin, is essentially to start out perhaps with a smaller group of nations, maybe 30 countries, countries who felt comfortable with the concept of democratic legitimacy and who had some democratic credentials. And then over time, you could expand the membership of the Parliamentary Assembly as countries themselves realized that it would be a useful venue for them to debate issues and to have an input into the decision-making of the Security Council and the General Assembly. The model that we have used for our World Parliamentary Assembly is indeed the European Parliament, but not as it operates today, but actually in terms of its historical evolution. The European Parliament began, it was actually called the European Parliamentary Assembly. It was established in 1958, and initially its members were actually parliamentarians from the 6 member countries of the European community at that time. And it was only in the late 70s that they went from appointing parliamentarians from member countries to direct vote, in a popular vote. So that would be one way. And in our proposal, we actually see a kind of a phased transition, where initially it would be made by parliamentarians from the member countries, and little by little in stages, we would move into direct elections for those countries that do have elections of members. On the Security Council, one of the interesting things is that a year before the United Nations was created, we had the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which gave rise to the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And it's really interesting to see the debates that took place over the 3-week period when 700 plus representatives from the member countries of the UN, got together at Bretton Woods. And they opted for a system of weighted voting from the outset. The IMF and the World Bank in their governance structure have always operated under a system of weighted voting. And it has served them well. I think it has enhanced their credibility in the areas in which they operate. And in our proposal in the book, we actually argue for moving to a system for the Security Council where we would use a system of weighted voting as well. In other words, one way to do away with the veto power is to essentially make the Security Council, which we call an executive council, universal in membership. Like the IMF board, like the World Bank board, every country has a vote, every country has a voice. It's linked to some economic parameters which give higher voice and bigger voice to China, to the US, to the European Union, but nevertheless, every country has a voice, as opposed to the Security Council today, where you have 15 countries which sit on the council, and then they speak on behalf of everybody else, sometimes accurately, sometimes not so accurately. One final point, although Colin, you raised a number of other issues, but I'm looking at the watch and I understand that we are supposed to have a period of open to the audience. It seems to me that yes, countries are not going to be willing to give up the veto, or as you nicely put it, Turkeys will not vote for early Christmas. It is difficult, of course, at this point to imagine the Russians and the Chinese, to say nothing of the Americans, you know, volunteering to give up their veto. And yet, of course, you know, everybody knows that the Security Council, as it operates today, is completely and totally dysfunctional. And so it's not as though the system is working very well, right? And it seems to me that as the credibility of the system is further undermined in coming years because of its inability to deal with global problems, which are of great concern to the population of the world, it will become at some point clear that the system needs a complete revamping. It needs a complete sort of rethinking because it's not working in any meaningful way. It's not, the United Nations is already not delivering on the promises that are embedded in the Charter. And so there will be increasing calls for reform simply because of what will be happening around us, as is happening today with COVID-19 and as is likely to happen in the future with climate change. So I'm not going to worry too much about the willingness or lack of willingness of the permanent members of the Security Council to give up their veto. There will come a time when they themselves will realize that it's not serving anybody's interest, not theirs, certainly not the interest of the collectivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augusto, and thanks again, Colin, for those really fantastic and thought-provoking comments and impressing upon us all the sense of urgency with which we need to start reforming the systems. So without further delay, I'd like to hand over to Renee, who's going to address the questions to you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Renee Murjani, and I'm the Secretary for the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies. First of all, thank you so much, Augusto and Colin, for your incredible talks. They were not only engaging, but also hopeful for many of us who've been studying the UN and disarmament for a while now. As Colin so wonderfully put it, you not only gave us a diagnosis, but also a vision for the future, which is incredibly important. And obviously, because of an engaging conversation like that, we have quite a few questions from the audience, which I'm just going to put to you right now. The first question I'd like to put to Augusto, and then if Colin, if you can respond to that as well, that would be amazing. Thank you. So the first question is, every few years, and especially on anniversaries of the United Nations creation, there are new calls to reform the UN and other international organizations. Much of this analysis and a number of the proposals in your book, Augusto, have been put forward before with very little success. Now we also have the added complication of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what about this present moment gives you hope that greater success can be achieved?
What gives me hope? There are sort of 3 or 4 things that give me hope for the future, and why I think this moment is laden with promise. One I already mentioned in my presentation, which has to do with that the current system, you know, has no credible defenders. Nobody is arguing credibly that we can muddle through, you know, under the current set of international institutions and the global order that emerged out of 1945, which has, as I said, remained frozen in time. So that suggests that there, you know, there is already this sense of sort of emerging, what's the word I'm looking for? Deep-seated worry about what is coming our way in coming years by way of climate change and other unresolved issues that are there festering in the background and that we're not doing anything about because we don't have the right institutions, or because the institutions that we have don't have the resources, they don't have the jurisdiction to actually deal with these problems in a way that delivers solutions. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is that we are much more interdependent today than we were at the time that the United Nations was created. The degree of connectivity, the degree of interdependence is 1,000 times bigger than it was at the time in 1945. And what does this mean? It essentially means that the costs of non-cooperation are infinitely larger today than they were back then. And I think that the fact that we are not meaningfully cooperating on the climate change side is going to make those costs explicit in coming years. And I think that will be a catalyst for finally changing the United Nations. Third, there has been a huge empowerment of civil society in the last few decades. I think that has been one of the most encouraging trends that we have seen in the last 20 years. When I look at what are the most important initiatives of international cooperation of the last 20 years, the International Criminal Court, the campaign to ban landmines, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the 2017 Treaty on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, all of these initiatives were led by civil society. Governments today are too busy dealing with the crisis, with the day-to-day. They don't have time to actually think big and to think about the broader interests of society. And in any case, the jurisdiction of governments working on their own is limited to their national territories, whereas the problems that we face are global in nature. So civil society is turning out to be a strong catalyst for change. And I point to these examples of the last 20 years as an indication of what's coming our way. And that gives me a source of optimism. And then finally, I think also science and technology are empowering people in a way that was not the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. There is a much greater awareness of the risks that we face. The young people especially are especially energized against these risks because they are the ones who are going to bear the biggest burden of these unresolved problems. So I think that all of these things coming together give me hope that in coming years, all these failed initiatives for reform will finally take hold. Because the alternative will just be too horrible to contemplate, It may mean an implosion of our current order and then having to rebuild a new order, after some kind of huge calamity. And I think, to quote Colling, using the precautionary principle, it's much better to prevent than to deal with the building already in a collapsed state.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Augusto. And I put that to Colin to respond to as well.
I will be very brief and say I share entirely the optimism and hope that Augusto has just expressed. But I do want to add one slightly darker thought as well, and that is that the growth in civil society engagement is growth on both sides of the ledger, in that we not only have civil society participants who are actively involved in wanting positive change in the system, we actually also have a growing and somewhat scary number of civil society participants who actually hate even what we've currently got by way of governance and want to roll it back to a more nativistic and brutal former world. I mean, just on my walk this morning here in Wellington, I passed a group of protesters in precisely that spirit. They're everywhere in the world and they are well-funded. They are more well-funded and better organised than those who are seeking to promote positive reform at this point. So there is a moment, but whether the moment may be one which is actually a window that's opening or a window that's closing, I think we have to be very alert to.
Thank you, Colin. My next question is for Augusto. It's from a member of the audience, and it goes like this. How can the UN fairly represent the world if the 5 permanent Security Council members have a veto that effectively means that 5 countries are ruling over the rest of the world, sometimes explicitly and at times implicitly?
You know, it's interesting to go back a little bit to the history of the UN and therefore the Security Council. You know that when you actually look at the minutes of the meetings that took place in the State Department after Roosevelt and Churchill launched the UN initiative in early 1942, the concept that was developed at that time was essentially a very sort of a multilateral concept whereby one would actually give the General Assembly legislative powers in a number of areas, and one would have essentially the beginnings of a world legislature. That was the idea, that was the concept. You know that when the United States was contemplating its contribution under Article 43, remember I quoted to you from Article 43 where it said that nations would make available to the Security Council troops and weapons and so on for the purposes of preserving peace and security. The Americans actually said, well, we're the biggest country, we have the biggest army, therefore our contribution has to be proportionately larger than that of other countries. So they consider making available to the United Nations 300,000 soldiers, more than 2,000 aircraft, and so on. A big laundry list of you know, an American contribution to that in the context of that article, right? So the question is, what changed from that very ambitious, why not say sort of all-encompassing vision of a UN that would actually be given the instruments and the tools to deliver peace and security and to prevent the next war? How come we ended in San Francisco in 1945, you know, with a pale shadow of it? And why is it that people like Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein and Grenville Clark were deeply disappointed with what came out of San Francisco? And the reason essentially is twofold. First of all, in October of 1943, there was a conference in Moscow. Churchill was there, Roosevelt was there. The idea was to persuade Stalin, you know, to join in this sort of multilateral effort. And Stalin, being you know, very cynical, said, look, I will be happy to sign on the dotted line of whatever organization you want me to join, provided you open a new front against Nazi Germany on the Western side, because we should defeat them, number one. And number two, provided that this organization is never going to tell me what to do and is never going to sort of impinge on my national prerogatives. And that was the genesis of the veto power. It was the price that we had to pay to get the Soviet Union on board. Number one, once they went back to Washington, Roosevelt realized that in order to avoid the same fate of Woodrow Wilson, who was ultimately not able to persuade the US Senate to ratify the covenant of the League of Nations, he needed to water down that very ambitious vision of a UN where you would have a General Assembly that would operate like a sort of an emerging world legislator. Because he realized the UN Charter is an international treaty. It requires 2/3 majority in the US Senate, and there was no way in which this ambitious vision was going to get the endorsement of senators from Kansas and Dakota and Alabama and Mississippi and so on. And so they basically watered down the charter to the point where they felt confident that this charter would then get approval from the US Senate, as it would get the okay from Stalin. And that is why the veto power was embedded. That is why they came up with the one country, one vote principle in the General Assembly. So the United Nations was created weak from its inception as the price that we paid for you know, having this approval of all the great powers. Of course, 75 years later, it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. And the person who poses the question is obviously picking up on this long history, but I don't want to repeat myself. The fact that it hasn't worked in the last 75 years doesn't mean that in the context of potentially very destabilizing crisis in coming years, there is not going to be a rethinking of the adequacy of the UN and whether, in fact, we don't need to strengthen it, we don't need to give it resources and to do the kinds of things which will actually deliver a United Nations that is actually able to give us solutions to the problems that we face.
Thank you, Augusto. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions. We did have a few more, and I'm sorry, but we have run out of time to answer them. So I very quickly now have to pass it on to my fellow colleague and board member, Jaden Van Lewin. He is part of the Young Global Scholars Group at the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies. He also completed his LLB from Victoria University of Wellington. And thank you for being here, Jaden. I'll pass it on to you now.
Thank you for that, Renee. I will just very quickly like to say on behalf of the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies and the New Zealand Centre for Public Law, a heartfelt thank you to both Dr. Lopez-Claros and Mr. Keating for being here today and for providing some really important and interesting insights into what is an ever more important topic. And I think that based on, at least on some of the feedback that we've already been receiving, the dialogue that we've been able to have here today between you and then also through questions from the audience has been something that has been very enriching and inspiring in a lot of ways as well. So we thank you very much for taking the time to contribute today. And lastly, thank you to our audience for making the time in your no doubt busy schedules to be with us for this important discussion. We hope to see you involved in our events in the future. So with that, thank you all and have a great rest of your Wednesday.